Hello, everybody. Hopefully, you have had a chance to read this. If not, um, that's okay. We'll go over everything quickly for Jeltova and Grigorenko. It's best read with a nice cold glass of Russian vodka. All right, here we go. Key ideas. They are looking at Jeltova and Grigorenko are looking at giftedness from a systematic approach. So they look at it from multidimensional model. They look at both internal and external process variables. They feel like actual giftedness is more about achievement. Giftedness being more covert often. They talk a lot about creativity being key to development and that it's culturally determined. They use an adaptation of Western identification. They talk about Olympiads and special schools. What the Russians believe. I thought these two quotes were really important for us to understand as far as what it is that Russians believe as far as giftedness. Of course, this is written after Perestroika, and it is, while it does talk about pre-Perestroika and it does talk about Sputnik, and it talks about the Great October Socialist Revolution. If you don't know a lot about Russian history, it is a little bit hard to kind of understand some of where they're coming from, but the Russians are very conceited people, and having spent several weeks over there myself through our adoption process, I feel like I have the ability to say that, but they definitely feel like they have the best system for everything, and especially when it comes to education. And I know with giftedness, especially, they see that as something that they've done very well at, especially with Olympians and whatnot. So this is an area in which they feel like they excel. I'm not going to read these to you. You can perfectly read these yourself, but these two sections are quotes are important. Okay, internal variables. They go to great lengths to make sure that they've outlined the different internal variables so that you understand what they are. They talk about process-related variables and product-related variables. The importance of understanding the difference between the cognitive and then like the performance behaviors. The fact that there's external congruence and there's internal congruence. We talk about the resilience of gifted individuals and the different things that help define giftedness in dialectic terms. I'm sorry. So underneath internal variables, they talk about abilities and strengths. They talk of just like a lot of other conceptions about general and domain-specific giftedness. They do say that every gifted individual has a profile of abilities with unique abilities, unique patterns, or relative and absolute strengths and weaknesses. They definitely are of the concept that there's not really anybody who's globally gifted. It's possible to be gifted in more than one area, but no one's really globally gifted. They also talk about actual and potential giftedness, that they distinguish between what's evident both through performance, giftedness, and potential. They went to great lengths to talk about giftedness being demonstrated through achievement. It was interesting that they thought that there was qualitative evidence that superior performances in extracurricular activities often translates to superior performance in real-life tasks. That's on page 174. I thought that was an interesting thing to be able to quote to your students who don't want to do anything after school. We did talk about overt and covert giftedness, that oftentimes giftedness is masked by multiple external and internal factors. They used Gardner's example, interestingly enough, of Albert Einstein. They talked about slow gifted children. I'm pretty sure they meant to say twice exceptional there, but they did talk about that. And they talked about how that there are some children that are it just takes them longer to develop giftedness. I thought this was interesting too, that they had a Russian psychologist that they quoted, Claude Noya, I think is how you would say it, who really kind of equates intellectual maturity as being similar to wisdom, which I thought was really interesting. Okay, creativity. They put a lot of emphasis on creativity, that the construct of creativity is really important to giftedness, and that they talk a lot about Russian psychological science in regards to it. That the intellectually gifted individual cannot engage in creative thinking well on their, without having been taught and also given the chance to do it. I thought it was interesting that they really emphasized the need of teachers to be able to help with this. And I love the quote about whether or not, how much creativity is considered bizarre versus just usual for the gifted person. I didn't put this down there, but they did talk a little bit about giftedness being a personality trait, whether or not really was a personality trait or not. Just on page 177. But they took that and went into cultural dimensions with that, so I kind of put that more under cultural dimensions because they kind of put it together, and more about the need to learn, and that being as a cultural dimension. Stasensko being one of the people that they quoted a lot with cultural dimension, and the fact that culture is not just an external factor that impacts individuals, but also being the internal factor. They went to great lengths to talk about, how much does culture impact the child versus the child impacting the culture, and the fact that Russian psychological science recognizes the complexity of the social, emotional, as well as the intellectual development in the gifted and strives to build up the resilience through the pedagogical process, which I thought was interesting. All right, identification. Russians really haven't come up with their own identification. They did talk about how they separate the difference between identifying a child who's currently gifted in one or more areas right now versus making what they call a prognosis or prediction for giftedness, or what I think Renzulli would probably call potential. They really feel like prognosis implies uncovering a giftedness in children, and they didn't seem very positive towards that idea. So in 1995, after Perestroika, they did start doing taking more of the Western tests and trying to make them into more Russianized. So they took the Torrance tests, creative thinking, and put them from English into Russian. They took the Stanford-Binet and made it into Russian. They used the Cattell and Raven progressive matrices as well. So there were a lot of different ones that they've done. It sounds like, though, from what they were talking about on page 179, that a lot of the tests have not necessarily been normed for Russia, which makes sense. Russia is very large, and the different areas of Russia are very different, and the educational levels are very different. So I can imagine that would, for educators, it would be near high to impossible to try and be consistent with that. However, I would assume that they would try to do that in some of the larger cities, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Interestingly enough, they did talk about Moscow and St. Petersburg, more of the prestigious preschool and elementary schools, and how they're using the Western tests still, which are still normed for the Western, and they're still using those as a guideline for identification. about Olympiads, and they weren't Olympiads as in like Olympics for like sports as much as it sounded more like Olympiads, like we have, science Olympiad, math Olympiad, those types of Olympiads. So more like different types of academic areas. And it was interesting that they went to, they talked a lot about how post-perestroika, the Russian system recognized the need for more humanities and arts in that. So they explained the system of how they, have the kids take all these tests in order to figure out who's going to be on the Russian teams for all these Olympiads. And of course, they boasted about how great their teams are. They also talked about some special schools that they have. They do have some boarding schools, some specialized secondary schools for gifted students. Talked about the grueling schedule on page 180. I was kind of interested on how little sleep these poor kids get and how much they have to do. They did talk about the different universities that accept these students, and it was interesting. They talked about a multidisciplinary educational program for gifted kids of ages 4 to 15 in Moscow School 1624. Schools like orphanages over in Moscow are numbered. It is called Sozvezdy, I think is how you say that. I don't know, it's hard to say. Anyway, it was an multidisciplinary school, and interestingly founded on the theories of Vygotsky and Elkon and Davidov with the developing education theory. So I talked a little bit about that. They found with that program that the biggest result, or at least the one that really stood out to me, was the fact that the kids had an increased intrinsic motivation, especially for independent research, which I thought was pretty cool. It sounded a lot like Renzulli's. The kids get to spiral through kind of thematic, and it was very much geared towards what the kids needed to learn. Okay, once again, key ideas: systematic multidimensional model, internal and external process variables, actual giftedness equals achievement, giftedness is often covert, creativity is key to development, it's culturally determined, they're adapting Western identification, they still don't have completely their own identification system yet, and as far as actually teaching gifted kids, they use Olympiads and special schools for them. My questions this week are more for a little bit of fun and talking outside of what we usually talk about. The authors believe we need to research how gifted individuals utilize their culture and if and how culture shapes giftedness. If this research was conducted in your school district, what do you think would be the findings and why? And I really love this quote on page 176 about creativity and bizarre. So I thought I'd ask about whether or not we agreed or disagreed with the author's point of view. So do you agree or disagree with the author's point of view that maybe when, by their own standards, they do engage in creative thinking, the process and products of gifted creative thinking are so far beyond a regular person's capacity for processing that such ideas or products might be considered bizarre? Why? And as they would say in Moscow, spasibo. Have a great night.